Start, Padmaji? Rekha ji, let me introduce you. Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum, and a very good evening to everyone. We are here for our first talk of the series, Inclusive Education, Rethinking Pathways. We are delighted to have with us Professor Dr. Padma Sarangapani and Professor Dr. Rekha Pappu. So Professor Padmaji is chairperson of the Center of Excellence in Teacher Education, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. She has led several projects in collaboration with the government to address issues of quality, teacher professional development, and school systems improvement. She has contributed a lot to national policies and other policy initiatives of the Government of India. And this includes her work on National Curriculum Framework 2005. And she has also, in addition to that, she has also been an expert with the UNESCO Teacher Task Force. So Dr. Padma was the founding managing editor of Contemporary Education Dialogue. She was involved in developing and establishing several teacher education programs across the country. And her current research interests include teachers' professional development, culture and pedagogy, work and professional education, and all this within a comparative educational context. Dr. Padma was the recipient of the Indira Gandhi Memorial Fellowship 1999 to 2021 and the Commonwealth Academic Fellowship 2015. And her work on connected learning initiative which involved using technology in secondary school setting, was awarded the UNESCO King Hamad's Award for the use of ICT in education 2018. And her most recent publication is the handbook, which she co-edited with Professor Dr. Rekha Pappu. And this is the handbook of education systems in South Asia. In addition to it, she also has a book on education, teaching, and learning discourses, cultures, and conversations. Thank you very much for being with us, Dr. Padma. We have our other honorable guest speaker for today is Professor Dr. Rekha Pappu. Dr. Rekha Pappu is the chairperson of the School of Educational Studies at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Hyderabad, India. As a researcher, teacher, and evaluator, she has been working for over 2 decades with institutions in the academic and the development center. Her research interests lie in issues related to education, gender, development, and social justice. And she has published widely in these areas and presented at national and international forums. So Dr. Rekha has led research projects and impact assessments for the state and central governments, as well as various national and international organizations. Her latest publication, as I said before, as an editor-in-chief, is with Dr. Padma Sarangapani, and this is the Handbook of Education Systems in South Asia. I've gone through it myself, an excellent read, and I think we should really go through it to understand how diverse education systems work in South Asia. Thank you so very much for being here, Dr. Padma and Dr. Rekha. Over to you, and you have 25 to 30 minutes to present your talk, and then we will open the floor for questions. I encourage everybody to put your questions in the chat, and once the talk is over, I'll either invite you to ask the questions or read your questions. Thank you so much. Over to you, Padmaji, Rekhaji, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Tayyaba. It's great to be back interacting with you and also your students and colleagues. So super. Rekha will begin and then I will pick up from the middle. So Rekha, please go ahead.
Let me add to that to say it's a pleasure and privilege to have this invitation to be interacting with all of you in Lahore University of Management Studies, students, colleagues, faculty, and as you said, partners from other institutions. What we would do is use a PowerPoint to outline some of the issues, and maybe they are briefly indicated, and we'd be happy to take them up further in the discussions as you would see fit. So let me just begin this. Yeah. Yeah, the reason we've put up the cover of the handbook that Tayyaba mentioned is to indicate that we are drawing a great deal from this handbook, which gave us an opportunity to understand different countries of South Asia. And one of the things that I would want to get into right away is this grouping called South Asia. There's a lot of discussion about which of the countries would be involved, would be included in South Asia. And we have the SAARC, which is very clear about, and we know which countries are members of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. But we went beyond that to include two other countries, which is Mauritius and Myanmar, that are not part of South Asia. And for reasons that I'll go into, we look in the handbook, we've looked really at the educational systems of 10 countries. And these are the countries: Afghanistan, alphabetically listed: Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Mauritius, Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. In our introduction and in our thinking through about what characterizes South Asia, we felt quite strongly, based on literature, and what we were finding was that, and this is what we've put out, and this is a direct quote from the introduction itself, that shared religions, languages, and overlapping ethnic groups across the countries of South Asia account for a distinctive culture and social character. That is what actually makes for this grouping called South Asia, other than political formations or any other aspect. But we also note that South Asia is a region with a history of internal conflicts over ethnic identities and development, and violent external conflict. So there's internal conflict and also external conflict that includes war and nuclear threats. So we are aware of these aspects as well. And notwithstanding the stark instances of brutality and aggression, the diversity and interaction among various groups in the region has given rise to a complex cultural fabric often described as syncretic. And those of us living in South Asia are intuitively aware of this aspect as well, and we share this. And and therefore, the diversity and pluralism have been the key founding myths of the communities that we are. And much before terms such as multiculturalism and communitarianism became a part of the discussions and political theories, we've had this lived out in the South Asian context. And we find that the 10 countries that we've included do have all these characteristics, but to further outline the similarities, or to at least flag what is common common to all these countries of South Asia, I think one very significant aspect which has shaped us in so many similar ways is the shared colonial legacy. All the 10 countries, they've not all necessarily been colonies. For instance, Nepal is a protectorate, and same with Myanmar as well. But there is that colonial influence, and therefore the shared colonial legacy that we have. The countries of South Asia, I mean, overwhelming and remarkable diversity in terms, there's linguistic diversity, there is religious diversity, or ethnic diversity. So you do find this as a specific aspect of all the South Asian countries that then, and as the talk title indicates, poses problems, but also there are opportunities for overcoming. I mean, there is potential and one needs to work through it, but absolutely the characteristic feature of all these countries is this kind of diversity. And the diversity, even while the diversity remains, I think what is common to what seems like a homogenization of these countries is the fact that there are international standards, international covenants that all these countries adhere to, abide by, ratify, and that the international element is strongly influencing the various aspects, including in relation to education, where external aids comes in for education apart from other developmental aspects or other aspects. So external aid that the countries of South Asia receive is an aspect that is also defines the kind of experiences that most of South Asian countries have. And one of it we find, which is what we have tracked in the section called, or we've hoped to track through the section on political economy of education, is the fact that this each of these countries has through the external aid, through the international global influence, through the influence of significant players in the international arena, has led to education reforms. And there is some similarity in the manner in which the education reforms have been taken up as well. So this is something that we track through the handbook. But one feature that continues from the post-independent period of all these countries is the fact that education is so closely linked to the mission of nation building. It is quite explicit. It is a feature of many, education systems of many countries the world over, but within South Asia, it is quite stark. And the section on curriculum actually traces how each, the curriculum of the different countries of South Asia actually have this nation building mission at the very center of its curriculum building, as well as different aspects of the education system itself. But the countries are also different. There is the matter of the country's size. Some of them are large, and India is large. So in terms of size, in terms of population as well. So you have India's population being somewhere close to 1.5 billion. And in contrast, you have a country like Maldives, which has like 0.5 million population. And the countries are different too in terms of the social, economic, and political context. And as Professor Tayyaba was mentioning that, I mean, this has implications also when we think of inclusive education. The contexts are different, and therefore what we imagine in terms of inclusive education, the issues that come up would be different as well, and one needs to look at them much more closely. The handbook makes a limited kind of attempt at this. The size of the education systems, again, are quite varied. Once again, India has close to 1.5 million schools in the present year, and a country like, once again, Maldives has something like 350 schools. So though we're talking of South Asia and some similarities, there are these kinds of dissimilarities as well. But the size is not proportionate to the kind of allocations in terms of the financing for education that is made. So Maldives actually has better financing for education than India, for instance. So there are these differences or dissimilarities that we would need to take into account when speaking of a region that has many commonalities as well. Once again, just to like track the education systems in South Asia and flag some of the characteristics why we will need to actually focus on education. What has been noted and what we emphasize also is that South Asia has the highest has a very high percentage of young population. There are 620 million children and adolescents, which make up 40% of the world's school-aged population is in South Asia, and 34% of the world's youth population live in South Asia, which is also why education systems, even viewed from the human capital approach, becomes very significant. I mean, that is the lens that is largely being used, and whereas internal concerns may be of a different kind, these aspects too are shaping the way in which education systems are offering education, so to say. All the South Asian countries have ratified international covenants, whether it's about child rights or increasingly about right to education. Not all countries have the right to education as a fundamental right, but in varied ways, the right to education in different formats is being recognized and has become a priority, a developmental priority for all the countries. Just to flag another aspect that we see in the education systems of South Asia is that though English is not the language of any of the countries, the number of English medium schools is growing rather, I don't know if it's exponentially is maybe not the right word, but is definitely growing, and so is privatization. But together with these English medium schools, we do have religious schools, different kinds of religious schools in different South Asian countries. And they, in terms of recognizing them, working with them, I'm not the work in relation with and in relation to these religious schools is once again not uniform across the different countries. So this is something that we would need to take into consideration when we are speaking also of inclusive education. Where are they positioned in the different countries? The education reforms in the present moment. At an earlier time, there was different kinds of priorities, but almost all the countries, we are today at a moment where the education reforms is geared towards addressing learning outcomes. And the emphasis is largely on basic literacy and numeracy or foundational literacy and numeracy. And almost all the countries, as the different chapters of the handbook note, are in the last few years, at the last decade, in India, for instance, it happened just a few years ago, but almost all the countries have come up with education policies in recent times, and these aspects have been flagged in significant ways. Now, if we were to move to the taking off from there, if we were looking at the learner diversity, I mean that this would be a huge advantage that we have the diversity, but then the diversity is not always tapped into. Instead, what we find more often is that it emerges as a marginality. So if we were to look at the diversity of learners, and all of us are familiar with the kind of diversity that we have in the South Asian countries, this would be along the axis of class, caste, gender, ethnicity, ability, sexual orientation, language, region, religion, and the intersectionality of all of these become very important when we're discussing both diversity as well as marginality, because this diversity is not always necessarily valued, and there are aspects of this diversity that get stigmatized, leading to marginalization. For instance, and again, this is not uniform across the country. We see some aspects highlighted in some countries. For instance, caste is marginalization of students belonging to lower castes, especially the scheduled castes, or as they are known in India and Nepal, the Dalits. That is found in these two countries in particular, whereas ethnic identities becomes a point of contention and marginalization conspicuously in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Sri Lanka. Different kinds of ethnic identities, but they're definitely ethnic identities that are hegemonic and those that are marginal. So this is another aspect that characterizes the education systems of South Asia. There are parts of the region, especially in countries such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, India, and Sri Lanka. So this covers almost all the countries of South Asia, where there are long-drawn conflict situations which impact education in adverse ways. So there is this dimension to it. Discrimination based on religion. This is yet another aspect that leads to marginality. It is increasingly becoming a feature of the Indian educational system. It has been prevalent in countries such as Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. And this has definitely impacted the education of different groups of students in these particular countries. Now, when we're talking of marginality, what we may want to discuss, though access seems like a very basic aspect, because but it's also a concept that can be extended to cover different kinds of barriers, such as it could be attitudinal barriers, systemic barriers, it is physical and geographical, physical barriers. It's also about curricular and pedagogical kind of barriers, which I mean, we would need to understand for each country in relation to, I mean, this would help us understand what access actually is all about. And one finds that in relation to access, the parameters could be about geographical and physical access. Most countries, nation states have made all efforts to provide the institutions, and the enrollment has increased as a result of this, but there are still pockets within every country where geographical or physical access is still a problem. And this becomes worse where there is conflict and conflict situations. It just becomes that much, it becomes very difficult. And of course, you have the various kinds of natural calamities or disasters, which then again intensify these aspects. Poverty is a feature which does impede access in very many ways, and in the hierarchies within the educational system, when quality is thought to align with private educational institutions, you find that poverty has a very I mean, and it affects the education of girls and different groups, where allocation of funds at the personal level becomes that much important. Social acceptability, once again, for all the reasons where identities are stigmatized, those students find it very difficult. Their experiences of education, we have different studies, we have autobiographical works where this aspect comes through in a very harrowing manner. So there's acceptability of migrants, of tribals, of transgenders, so different kinds of stigmatized identities. There's no social acceptability. And the fact that there are so many languages in use within these countries. For instance, in India, the census has found that there are more than 1,000 languages, close to 1,500 languages, though the recognized or official languages are only about 21, 22. This multiplicity of languages too impacts education and learning. So what can one do in terms of inclusion? Just a few ideas that have come up from different studies that have been taken up and cited in the handbook. The critical role of the teachers has been repeatedly, emphasized. And therefore, interventions have been made at different levels. This is one mode through which one would aim for inclusivity. And if I were to jump to another point, it is the need for fostering belongingness. I think this different studies have shown is the most effective way that the subjective emotional belongingness, if it is fostered within students, it also has a positive impact on academic achievements. And here too, I think teachers would play an extremely important role. There's also curricula and textbook content. I mean, this is always, there are always textbook fights. There is discontent about the manner of representation of certain aspects, but then what one is also addressing is hegemonic dominance and epistemic, the kinds of knowledges that are put forward, that are forefronted, which don't necessarily cover or represent different kinds of, or include different kinds of knowledges. So this is something that addressing this is a challenge, but is also an opportunity to enable inclusion in education. Efforts to involve the community members is something else that has been tried and has been partially successful in different contexts. I talked of belongingness. There also, when one is talking of systemic barriers, one is referring to policy level thinking. One is also thinking of the financial allocation or budgetary allocations that are made, whether they're adequate or not. But these policies, again, inclusive education has, in policy terms, become an important consideration. And there you find that there is greater emphasis on child-centered policies and practices. But this does not always mean that child-centered policy and practices have a social are working within a social justice framework. So child-centered is skewed in different ways, but the fact remains that there is an attempt to make it child-centered, which is a step forward and would need to be, one would need to move further in those directions and clarify for ourselves what the equity framework is as well. Now, one of the things that we need to recognize is that the kinds of hierarchies that we find within educational, or the marginalization of students that we find within educational system, is a reflection of the kind of marginalization that they have within the society itself. So it's not that the educational system can address all of these. But one would also need to acknowledge that the education system, in trying to address some of these, actually creates or reifies some of the hierarchies in a problematic manner. So that is something one would need to be alert towards, and acknowledge too that there is within education the potential. This is something that's always been talked about, the potential to usher in changes that could bring in equity and social justice within educational institutions. So this is what I would want to flag in relation to marginalization of students and in relation to inclusive education. For this other aspect of our discussion, I would ask Padma to take over.
So thanks, Rekha. Tayyaba, do you think we should pause for any questions or comments on this part? Or should we just do it together?
We can, but I suppose, why don't we get all the questions together? It will save time.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm going to...
I hope I didn't take too much time.
No. I'm going to speak a little bit about teachers and teacher education system. The slides are more general in the sense that I've tried to look at systemic questions broadly, and I will try to, wherever relevant, point to features that intersect with questions of inclusion of children, both with special needs and disabilities, as well as from socially marginalized communities. So the region as a whole has a teacher-pupil ratio of 34:1 in the primary section and 29:1 in the secondary school space. In fact, this is not very positive as ratios. The global average is 18:1, and actually availability of teachers needs to be higher per student. We need to have, the ratio shouldn't be as high as it is here. If we have to actually cater to teachers serving all regions and also meeting all the subject requirements, especially in the secondary school level. This suggests that there are teacher shortages within the system. And I think all of us in all countries, in fact, across South Asia, we know the reality of teacher shortages. In fact, it's estimated that by 2030, South Asian region will need 15 million teachers, out of which 4.1 million will be at the primary school level and 10.9 will be required at the secondary school level. The secondary school level is, I think, especially of importance because in the region, by and large, high levels of enrollment have been achieved in primary school. But in secondary school, we are really dealing with questions both of expansion of the system, increasing access and inclusion within the secondary school system. So the teacher need in the secondary school space is in fact very high for the entire region. Within the region, there are great unevennesses of teacher availability. But within the region, we don't see any kind of teacher mobility. Teachers, in fact, the employment of teachers seems to be a fairly local, national, not just national, but regional matter. Even within India, we don't see much migration of teachers from region to region. Some exceptions are Maldives and Bhutan. Until recently, the Indian teachers used to migrate and teach in the Maldives and Bhutan. But now even in these countries, the teaching job is largely reserved for local population. The number of teachers, professionally trained teachers in the system has increased overall, which is generally positive. But as Rekha pointed out, in our region, one of the very striking characteristics is the very high proportion of private schools. And within the private schooling space, we find teachers with lower professional qualifications. And this is something to note. In general, in the entire region, teaching lacks recognition as a profession. Yeah, so let's. So partly what we did in this handbook was engage with this question of the professional status of teachers, because this question actually impacts on quality of teaching which is available, and it also impacts on the aspiration to become a teacher within the system, as well as implications for the teachers who are already within the system. And it seems like a contradiction because, in fact, in the region, whether it's in Pakistan or India or Sri Lanka, in all the religious traditions, the idea of a teacher is very, very highly valued. We have a cultural tradition of valuing teachers, whether it is in the name of Guru or Ustad or Maulana. A teacher is a revered person. And teachers enjoy this kind of cultural value within the system. They are authority, they enjoy a lot of authority in the classroom. They're traditionally known to exercise tremendous professional autonomy and, cultivate systems of memorization as learning, obedience in the classroom. These are many of the cultural ideals which even today many teachers carry into classrooms. However, it seems that the colonial experience really turned teaching, which was a culturally valuable ideal and profession, into a very servile employee of the state. This is an argument that Krishna Kumar has made in his very famous paper, The Meek Dictator. And that is the kind of ideal that we associate with teachers today, that on the one hand, culturally, they enjoy tremendous authority within their classrooms, and they can be, all the cultural notions play out within the space of the classroom. But otherwise, within the system, they're actually very servile, and they have very low professional status. This was actually noted even in the colonial system. Way back as 1923, in the quinquennial reports, which portray the education we find in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh to a large extent, there are comments like this, that these people don't command anybody's respect. Their influence in the system is next to negligible, and they don't seem to be really providing any good to the teachers. In other words, on the whole, as a part of this, on account of this colonial experience, we have begun to associate teachers with a deficit image and a deficit identity. And that's really important for us to recognize, because a lot of our policies, a lot of our programs are really programmed around this idea of deficit teacher. And all the time we're trying to fill gaps. And that's really been the large, influence of the colonial system. I do just want to go back to the previous slide, Rekha. Along with this ideal, of the cultural ideal of the teacher as a guru, we should recognize that our own cultural traditions also offer to teachers many problematic ideals regarding inclusion of students within the classroom. Many of our cultures actually legitimize keeping certain groups of children out of the school, keeping girls out of the school, not catering to their needs, not believing that they're educable. These are also ideas that teachers inherit as a part of the cultural resource. The culture, which is so strongly marked in our entire region, offers both of these very, very contradictory ideals. The next slide, thanks. Post-independence, I want to just note a few features that have marked our common histories. That almost throughout the region, post-independence, the need to increase the supply of qualified teachers was a call. I mean, way back in 1947, in the first education conference in Pakistan, this is going out as a call. The first University Education Commission in India is again calling for to increase the supply of professional teachers. But on the whole, this idea of the identity, role, and the nature of the professional work of the teacher was being determined not by the teachers as professionals, but more by administrators. In other words, the entire professional identity and what makes a good teacher, what does good teaching entail has largely been determined by an administrative imagination and has not really emerged from a very strong professional assertion. Yeah, the next slide. So if we look at the teacher education system within countries, in some countries, they continue to be externally funded. There's very little national state investment into the teacher education system in the countries. And in many of our countries, a large part of teacher education is privately provided. It's actually self-financed. It's only in Bhutan and in Sri Lanka that the state completely invests and provides for teacher education systems. And this is really important for us to understand because, this really tells us what is going to drive the direction of professional reform. Is it going to be catering to a private market where teachers are going to find employment, or is it going to be driven by some kind of state policy and imagination of how teachers need to be professionally prepared? Within the countries, we find variation. By and large, there is a movement towards recruiting professionally trained teachers, but we continue to find direct recruitment of people without qualification in Pakistan and Sri Lanka and in Bangladesh. Again, the length of the professional training varies hugely from country to country, from 9-month long programs to 4-year-long programs. But across all countries, we train primary teachers as generalists. We train secondary school teachers as subject specialists. And in fact, almost all countries have trainings of teachers for special needs, but that's almost in like a parallel separate system. It's not integrated into the mainstream of teacher preparation across the countries. Policies in all the countries flag quality as an issue. Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal have independent regulatory bodies that are supposed to enhance the quality of teaching. And at least in India, we have a separate regulatory authority for children with disabilities, preparation of teachers with disabilities. So it's not integrated into the main imagination of teacher formation. And only Bhutan actually has an articulation of professional standards. India is in the process of creating it, but it's not officially a part of the policy framework as yet. Now, the question of who becomes a teacher is really directly related to how attractive the profession is. And what we find is that this entire sector has low salaries. In fact, it's even much lower in the private sector. And ironically, that's the only sector which is growing and recruiting teachers. Where in the government schooling system, teachers are better paid, but that system is simply not recruiting teachers in many of our countries. What I recently found in a study on India is that, in fact, teachers of children with special needs receive even lower salaries compared to other teachers. They're receiving like half the salary that a generalist teacher would receive. The career growth is negligible. There's almost no career growth. You enter as a teacher, you retire as a teacher. You only get your yearly increments. And across the region, the emergence of para-teachers has really depressed the system because there is a separate channel through which people become teachers. So the profession itself is very, very poorly, it's not forming in a very strong way. And they are not able to signal strongly the value of becoming a teacher or pursuing teaching as a profession. On the whole, also the conditions in the schools are very poor. So teachers have low morale. And in many of the countries in the region, there's a lot of politicization in recruitment, in transfers, and this also affects overall job motivation. So in other words, we can clearly see that as a community of professionals engaged with teaching, with teacher education, we really have a big struggle in terms of establishing value for the profession. And especially if we want to bring in issues of inclusion into the mainstream of teacher education, there's a very long, tough battle for us to fight. The next slide. If we look at the content of teacher education, there's interesting when we look at it historically. That, all of us know that basically teacher education used to take place in these normal schools. And the content of this curriculum was very non-intellectual. It largely focused on habit formation, character building, and this entire Horbashian lesson planning. And so overall, the profession's epistemological character is quite weak. And within our region, sociologically also, it is not very well established. So clearly we can see if you're going to make arguments that teaching is a profession and that, curriculum must respond to the diverse kinds of issues that school systems need. We really have to fight and succeed in this battle of professionalizing the content of teacher education itself. Especially in Pakistan and in India in the 1950s and the 60s, because of USAID-driven programs, and many of our teacher education programs, Bloom's taxonomy, mastery learning, entered into the curriculum. But from the 80s onwards, when foreign aid started entering into our systems, the entire focus shifted to in-service teacher education, and pre-service teacher education kind of just fell off the policy focus. A lot of the state attention was simply going into in-service teacher education through cascaded models. I'm bringing this up a point specifically because the identity that is formed during pre-service teacher education pretty much makes the teacher for her life. And all of us who work in the in-service teacher education space know how little we are able to achieve in the in-service teacher education space in terms of actually building professional practice. So this pre-service space is of crucial importance. And I think as a community in the region, we have to think very seriously about how we raise its visibility in the policy space and its standards. So just, this is almost the last slide. There are common features of the curriculum that we offer. In terms of the practice, there's very little attention being given to the practice of teaching and how we prepare in the practice of teaching. The content knowledge in many countries is very neglected. And in fact, in the inclusive and special education space, the absence of adequately trained subject teachers for secondary school is a marked missing piece. We simply haven't even wrapped our heads around how we prepare inclusive teachers in the secondary school space. The curriculum tends to be very rigid. And very often in curricula in Nepal, in Maldives, even in India, and I'm sure it's the case in Pakistan, a lot of the content of the curriculum is very obsolete and outdated. Yeah. And one feature which has been noted is that in teacher education spaces, there's almost no research which is going on. It's just practice, practice, practice with no research. So the entire renewal of the knowledge base of teacher education is actually in dire straits. And the school curriculum reform and the pre-service teacher education curriculum are not very well aligned. So these are some of the issues. So it seems that most of the common features are in terms of issues that we commonly face across the countries of the region. I think the last slide, if there is one. Yeah. So yes, so those are broadly the features of the teacher education system and the ability of the system to respond to questions of inclusion across the board. So back to you, Syed.
Padmaji and Rekha ji for this fascinating talk. I'll go to the questions that our students and faculty have posted. There's just one question that I would like to ask before. So it is very interesting that you talk about this deficit identity of the teachers. And then we also talk about this traditional view of teacher as a guru. So do you think, so in a way, both of these are problematic. So what way do you suggest, or what type of, cultural intervention, I would say? Or how do you go about it? How do you resolve this? Over to you.
Rekha, any thoughts? How do we resolve? Let me first respond and then I'll ask Rekha if she has thoughts to add. I think you're absolutely right, Tayyaba. The deficit view is as problematic as this cultural identity. I mean, in the cultural identity, there seem to be some very strong positive ideas that we can carry forward. And in fact, I feel we must remember the cultural identity and the cultural roots, because ultimately teaching itself is cultural work. Yeah. And reforming teacher education is also a cultural process. So I think we have to really figure out how to build and modernize the culture or infuse new ideas into cultural traditions rather than leave them to stagnate where they are. So the stereotypes that have become a part of the mainstream cultural imagination, I think we have to infuse with new discourses around teachers and force. We have to challenge some of the stereotypes about educability. We have to challenge stereotypes about absolute authority of teachers within the classroom. So we have to problematize this cultural heritage and kind of, I would say, make it more contemporary.
So what I will ask Anushe and Tareem to ask their questions. So we'll put 3 questions to you, and then you could have more space to answer these questions as Rekha ji, as you and Rekha ji feel right. So Tareem, could you come with your question? Please ask short questions so that everyone has space. And then Anushe ji. Tareem, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, I can hear you. And thank you for the very informative talk. I just wanted to ask regarding the career growth you talked about, that how can we ensure the growth of students without identifying their interests and skills on the individual basis? And can you also tell me that how can we create awareness among students about what career they need to choose, or how can they become career oriented?
All right. And Anushe, very quick question later. I see several, just pick one main question to ask, please. Ji Anushe.
Sure. So thank you so much, Dr. Padma and Dr. Rekha, for such an incredible and insightful talk. So according to research, teacher identity is essential to the teaching profession, as it provides a framework for teachers to construct their ideas of how to be, how to act, and how to understand their work and their place in society. My question is that how does teacher education approach this reality, if at all? Thank you.
All right. And there was one more question by Asia, I guess, and she was talking about how do you deal with the question of inclusiveness in private schools when they are focused so much on performing better, like they're focused on performance. Ji, over to you. Over to you.
Rekha, why don't you go first? Yeah. Rekha?
I hope she's not dropped out. I'm just checking.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can see her over here.
Oh, okay. Maybe she's dropped out. I'll get her back. But in the meantime, in the interest of time, let me also just take this forward. So on the question of careers and how to enable students to actually aspire for careers, I think, this is one of the most important questions in inclusion, which is the ability to cultivate the ability to aspire. And for that, students need to feel that first of all, they need to know much more than they know. And they also need to feel that they can aspire, and they will find the resources to aspire for it, to achieve their aspirations. So I think this foreground of aspirations is something that we need to be thinking about and preparing teachers to cultivate in their students. So the social capital that teachers can devolve to their students actually enables students to aspire. And I think all of us who work with children from marginalized communities know that very often their motivation to stay in education is linked to the fact that they don't know where this education will take them. And so as teachers, we have a responsibility for that as well. And I think the devolution of social capital, I'm increasingly convinced that that is actually one of the fundamental tasks of a teacher. So we don't have to direct students into careers, but we need to open up possibilities to them and enable them to, and share our social networks with them. Very often the teacher in a local community is the one with the biggest social network. And she needs to give her students access to her own social network to actually enable and cultivate this ability to aspire. But it's a very important issue, this cultivating the ability to aspire. The second question on whether teacher education actually cultivates teacher identity. I think we are not doing it consciously enough within our programs of teacher education. And also across the region, teacher education programs tend to be very status quoist. And teachers basically acquire the message that their identity must be determined by the institution where they will work. They have to subsume their identity to the identity of the institution. They should not have a strong professional identity. And many of us who have worked in private institutions, who have friends and family in private institutions, know that private managements can't tolerate teachers who are very confident about their work. They want them to comply with the management point of view. And this is like a tussle. I think in the teacher education programs, we need to build consciousness of the profession of teaching and awareness of what it means to be a professional. I think we'll have to do some deliberate work on it because we know where we are. We also know that teachers need to be more confident about their identities. But as professionals, right now, what I find, at least in the Indian context, is that a lot of teachers draw their professional identity from the idea of a guru. But that's not good enough for today's world. We need to have a more modern conception of teacher identity. And guru works when there's nothing else. So clearly we need to provide something, some alternative to the idea of guru. There was a third question, but I'm afraid I've forgotten, Tayyaba.
I think it was more about, I think we'll come to it in a minute. We have with us Dr. Sophia Siddiq. Sophia, if you would like to go ahead with your question, please. Sophia?
Yeah, here. Thank you so much. This actually, my father is listening to the seminar with me. It's his question. I'm just going to paraphrase. He's wondering from the authors, and I think he's excited. I've been showing him the book alongside as well. So he's very impressed with the kind of work that you guys have produced. So thank you so much for that. And he's wondering whether in the course of producing this work and in your research process, were you able to draw upon examples from Western or Eastern European educational systems, or even Southeast Asia, to help us understand how, for example, conflict affected economies, because Pakistan is a big one in that. So how have those education systems recovered from all the issues that they've been struggling with? And do we see any potential, not for transferring, but at least borrowing or adaptation into the South Asian contexts? I hope that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Tayyaba, any other questions, or how would you?
We have Maham over here. Maham, please, could you please ask your question, and then Rabia, Tayyaba, please go ahead, please. I'm afraid we can just take these two more questions and then it's done. Yeah. So Maham and Rabia.
Okay, so I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the inclusivity and representation when we talk about the teaching profession, the whole teaching community. So I'm actually wondering about that. If we aren't practicing the representation, the inclusivity, when we are hiring our teachers, when we are training them, and when we are promoting the teacher education, are we in a position to think about implementing practicing inclusive classrooms? Because what I feel is, I see teachers as the change agent, as one that are actually working on or promoting the policies that has been designed around these concepts, inclusivity, about the inclusivity. So I'm just thinking about, what if we start thinking about first being inclusive when we are talking about the teaching profession.
Yeah.
Thank you, Maham. Ji, Rabia. Rabia, short question, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Rekha ji, my question is from you. That was something really interesting about the need to belong, the belongingness needs of a child, that the teacher can fulfill those needs. The teacher can feel the students, make the student feel that he or she or they belong to a place. If it is a very diverse classroom, like I teach in a very diverse classroom, so the students feel unsafe, their safety needs are not met. So I feel like I want to make them feel that if they don't belong to their homes, because they have very toxic environments at homes as well. So how can I do that? What are the effective ways that I can incorporate in my lesson plan or pedagogy that my students feel that they belong to at least this class from 7:45 a.m. till 2:15 p.m. Thank you.
Sorry, Padma ji, there is one comment by Dr. Shazia Ivan. Shazia, would you like to make a comment? So maybe Padmaji can comment on it. We're just running short of time.
Yeah. No, and that's why I just left the comment, because I didn't want to take time away from the speakers. So thank you, Padmaji and Rekha both, for such a wonderful talk. I was just thinking that, and my comment is there, that a lot of time teachers, I feel like in Pakistan, because I can only speak for Pakistan, having worked in teacher education, that there are these reactive approaches. It's like, we don't have trained teachers, let's train them for a month, for a day, for 3 days, and then get it over with. And then the solutions are there. So I'm thinking about, do you have any ideas about that proactive approach that actually aligns with your pre-service teacher education, but also kind of these bite-sized certification? I want to push back, and I don't know how to do that, because there is a benefit to that as well. So I'm just going to finish my thought here, but if you could just, because that would, am I thinking too much about it? So yeah.
No, I mean, all absolutely exciting questions. I'm so delighted to be in this group and have this opportunity. I'm not able to get Rekha back on the call. She seems to have fallen off. So I'm just going to also pitch for the ideas that she shared. But starting off with the question of, how widely have we been able to look at literature, whether we've been able to look at Europe, Southeast Asia, informing ideas. I'm afraid that our scope has been more narrow. To some extent, I think we have been able to dip into European literature, but Southeast Asia is just not known enough to us, and we have not had opportunities to engage with it. In fact, until we began this project of the handbook, as scholars from the region, we had not engaged with the research from other parts of the region itself. We so much more used to reading from only the English-speaking Western publications. So this opportunity was really great. And now that other handbooks exist that give us the lens on Southeast Asia, I think it's really important for us to look at it. So I hope we'll come back to you with more concrete ideas of how experiences in other parts of the world can inform our practice. With regards to the question of representation in the teaching community and inclusivity within the teaching community, this is an extremely important question. And in fact, it is very difficult to find the data that allows us to comment on whether the demographic profile of teachers adequately reflects the demography of the population that they teach. But this is a very important question. And in a way, I'm contradicting what I said earlier. I mean, I think it's really important for teachers from other communities to teach children from different communities. I don't really subscribe to the view that teachers should be from the same community as students, because the devolution of social capital is a very important function of teachers. And it's only in the space of the school that the student actually comes out of their own community identity and works in the public space. So I think the diversity of identities for interaction is very central. Having said that, I do believe that on the whole, given that all our countries subscribe to compulsory schooling, it stands to reason that there should be teachers from all communities in the teaching workforce, and that the teaching workforce should not be selectively from only some communities, as it turns out to be this case. In fact, I find it deeply problematic that our profession is getting so feminized. I mean, if broadly our population has at least 40 to 50% women to men, shouldn't the teaching workforce similarly represent this demography? But we don't find it to be the case. So I think we really need to get much more data to understand inclusivity and representativeness. Also, so that students from different communities encounter teachers from very different communities and understand and form their own identities in a much more plural space of the school. So I think it's a really important research issue, and we should also start gathering data on these questions for the region. On the question of belongingness and being valued, I think this is really the center of enabling children from marginalized communities to succeed, right? They must feel that they are valued and that they are valuable people. And so the sense of belongingness is really the communication from the teacher that I value you. And I'm sure as a teacher, you're already doing many of the things that work. You're giving them voice in your classroom. They're getting to speak in their own languages and their dialects. And I'm sure you're not rebuking them when their pronunciation is different home standard pronunciation. So when you practice these things, you really communicate to the student that they are valued within the classroom. And absolutely, one of my research students was looking at teachers who work with children in very difficult circumstances. And these teachers were trying to make sure that while the children are at school, they will forget the trauma that they experience within the home. And the school will enable them to be different people. And I think these are really important things that I'm sure you're already practicing in your school, but we need to talk much more about it and make it a part of mainstream discourse. And Rekha's back, I'm really pleased. So Rekha, on the belongingness question, I hope you'll have more to say. Lastly, on the question of skills, absolutely. I am completely in alignment with you when you're pained by these patchwork, small 5-day, 3-day trainings. They tend to be so skill oriented, right? We know that the teacher teaches from her person. She doesn't teach through skills. And so the identity formation is the core work of teacher education programs. It's not just, I'm a teacher kind of identity formation. It's a very professional kind of identity formation. And we cannot reduce teaching to skills, which is what is happening in many of these patchwork programs. So I think we have to really bring back attention to what is involved in professional formation of teachers, to kind of point out the limited achievements of these small programs and why we'll achieve a few things, but we should not think that they will really solve the problem of qualification of teachers. So that's all I'd like to say. And Rekha, over to you.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. It's quite unusual. I'm glad I was able to at least make the presentation. And because I got disconnected, I seem to have lost the chat, it seemed to have so many interesting questions. I thought I'll read through them. Sorry, but I'm also not sure whether I'm very late, Tayyaba. So you let us know how you'd want to go ahead.
I think we are almost towards the end, and it's hardly we are left with, I think we've just 2 more minutes. If you would like to add a few things to how engagement is related to achievement in schools and how the background from which the student comes might affect this engagement in school and what can school do. I think Padma ji has commented on it, but somebody actually put your name over there and wanted you to answer it. So I thought I could just give it a go before we wrapped up.
Yeah, right. Thank you. So I seem to have lost the thread of the discussions, but I think the reference is probably to this, what Padma flagged about belongingness. Yes, the diverse range of identities that students carry through to be able to value all of them. And very often our textbooks are the discussions, the textbooks highlight certain kinds of identities, but if it is, of course, there are efforts to change the curriculum, change the textbooks that's on, but as part of teacher preparation, as part of the training programs for teachers to not stigmatize identities or add to that. And this notion of belongingness, I think, needs to be explored further, how that can be fostered. There are different kinds of programs, schemes, incentives that are provided, of course, but then that emotional and subjective dimension, including for the disabled. I think that the way different kinds of efforts at the school level, at the institutional level. So there are, of course, from the policy end, there are fellowship provided, and there is something like reservations at the higher educational institutions, whereas these are mechanical, technical aspects. Their implementation needs to be done in the spirit in which they are introduced. I think that becomes so much more important. It's part of the cultural belongingness, inclusiveness, which is what we would need to get at. So that's what was being flagged.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rekha ji. Thank you, Padma ji. It has been a privilege to listen in, to learn from you, to know about your work. And thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for this fascinating talk and excellent questions. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, Padma ji.
Thank you very much. We've really enjoyed this. Tremendous.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that.